Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The boy learned early that cities could burn. He stood in the October cold, 7 years old, watching smoke rise from what used to be streets. The smell stayed in his nose for weeks afterward. Charred wood, melted metal, something sweeter and worse that nobody named. Chicago smoldered like a dying campfire, and people wandered through the ruins looking for things that no longer existed. His father had gone to work 3 days before the fire started, a clerk in a land office near the courthouse. The boy remembered his wool coat, the way he smelled of tobacco and ink. Then the flames came, and the coat never returned. Neither did the man who wore it. An aunt took him in at first. She lived in a district the fire had missed, north past the river. Her apartment smelled of boiled cabbage and resentment. She had 4 children of her own and a husband who worked the lumber yards. The boy slept on the floor near the stove and tried to make himself small. He learned to eat quickly, to ask for nothing, to disappear into corners. After 8 months, the aunt's husband lost patience with feeding another mouth. The streets taught him the rest. He swept floors at a bakery for stale bread. He ran errands for shopkeepers, carried packages, learned which alleys were safe and which belonged to older boys with hard fists. The city rebuilt itself around him, wood rising from ash, people arriving daily on trains, everyone rushing to claim space in the new Chicago. He slept in stairwells when winter allowed, in doorways when it did not. Henrik found him stealing newspapers from outside a print shop on Canal Street, not to read. The boy could barely manage simple words then, but to stuff inside his thin jacket against the cold. The printer was a thick man with hands stained permanent black and a Swedish accent that made every sentence sound like a question. He grabbed the boy's collar, ready to deliver either a beating or a lecture, then stopped. What he saw made him sigh instead of shout. The shop smelled of ink and oil and hot metal. Henrik pulled the boy inside, pointed to a corner near the coal stove. He brought bread and cheese, watched the boy devour it, then brought more. When the boy fell asleep, sitting up, Henrik covered him with a canvas tarp that smelled of chemicals. That was how it began. Henrik lived in rooms above the shop, narrow spaces filled with newspapers and books in languages the boy did not recognize. The printer had lost his own son to fever the year before the fire. He never spoke of it, but the boy understood anyway. They made an arrangement without words. The boy would work, would learn, would earn his keep. Nothing was given freely, but nothing was taken back either. The work was harder than sweeping floors. The boy learned to sort type from the cases, tiny metal letters backward in their compartments. His fingers fumbled at first, mixing the P's and Q's, dropping the delicate pieces. Henrik showed him once, twice, then let him practice until his fingers moved without thinking. The boy learned to read by setting words backward, understanding sentences in reverse. He learned that stories came in pieces, assembled letter by letter, word by word, locked into frames called chases. The press itself was a beast of iron and wood, taller than Henrik, hungry for paper and attention. It clacked and thundered when it ran, shaking the floorboards. The boy learned to feed it sheets, to time his movements so the rollers would not catch his fingers. He learned that ink had to be mixed fresh, that rollers needed washing, that 1,000 things could go wrong between the idea of a page and the finished product. Henrik printed handbills mostly, auction notices, advertisements for patent medicines and furniture sales. Sometimes he printed small newspapers for the Swedish community, dense columns about politics in a homeland the boy had never seen. The boy learned to spot his own mistakes in the finished sheets, a backward letter, an uneven line. Each error taught him something. Mrs. Kowalski ran the boarding house 2 streets over. She was Polish, built solid as a brick chimney, with flour always dusting her apron. She fed Henrik his supper most evenings and tolerated the boy's presence with the same practical kindness she showed the stray cats that lived in her cellar. Her soup was thin but hot, heavy with cabbage and potatoes, sometimes a bit of sausage when her husband's pay was good. She never asked about the boy's parents. In those years, half of Chicago was orphans, or might as well be. The boy grew into the work. His shoulders broadened from lifting paper reams. His hands developed calluses in new places. He learned the rhythm of the shop, the morning sorting, the afternoon printing, the evening cleanup. He learned to mix ink until it was exactly right, not too thin, not too thick. He learned to spot worn type and replace it, to oil the press bearings, to catch problems before they ruined an entire print run. Tommy worked in the print shop 3 buildings down. He was 2 years older, loud where the boy was quiet, always ready with a joke or a complaint. Tommy dreamed of better things, factory work that paid real wages, or maybe a position as a streetcar conductor. He mocked the boy's dedication to the trade, called him Henrik's little shadow. Tommy spent his pay at the saloons on West Madison, came to work foggy-headed, made careless errors. The boy did not judge him for it. Everyone needed something to blur the edges. What the boy loved were the newspapers themselves, not just printing them, but reading them afterward. He learned about the world through those columns of dense type, about strikes at the stockyards, about fires in tenement buildings, about aldermen making speeches and businessmen making fortunes. He read about murders and trials, about ships arriving from Europe, about the price of wheat and the plans for new railways. The newspapers showed him that the city was larger than Canal Street, that the world was larger than Chicago. He noticed other things, too. The way certain stories appeared once, then vanished. The way some crimes were described in detail, while others merited a single line. The way the newspapers never seemed to mention who owned the tenement buildings that kept burning, or why the factories where men lost fingers paid no damages. The official version of things rarely matched what he saw on the streets. By the time he was 17, he could set type as fast as Henrik. His hands moved through the cases with practiced certainty, plucking letters, assembling lines, building pages. He understood the grammar of layout, the way headlines drew the eye, the way white space could emphasize or conceal. He had grown tall, thin but not weak, with ink-stained fingers and intelligent eyes that took in more than he spoke about. Henrik paid him a small wage now, enough for a room of his own and meals beyond soup. The boy, no longer quite a boy, stayed in the rooms above the shop anyway. The money went into a tin box hidden behind a loose board. He was not sure what he was saving for, only that saving felt important. Sometimes he walked through the wealthy neighborhoods on Sunday afternoons. Prairie Avenue, where the stockyard kings and railway barons built their mansions, stone houses 3 stories tall, with iron fences and manicured gardens. Carriages lined the curbs. Women in silk dresses stepped carefully around the evidence of horses. These people inhabited the same city he did, but they might as well have lived in a different country. He wondered what they read in their newspapers. Whether the same stories reached their breakfast tables, or whether their version of Chicago was cleaner somehow, the rough edges polished away. The gap between their world and his felt permanent, fundamental. Not unjust exactly. He had not yet learned to think in those terms, but simply the way things were. The city had 2 faces, one that rebuilt itself in marble and steel, one that burned every few years in wooden tenements where people like Mrs. Kowalski lived their entire lives. Henrik coughed more that winter. He blamed the coal dust, the long hours, the damp cold that settled into the shop. He still worked the press, still corrected the boys' spacing with a grunt and a gesture. But sometimes he sat down suddenly, hand pressed to his chest, breath coming hard. The boy pretended not to notice. They had their arrangement. Work earned its keep, weakness was private. On slow afternoons, the boy read the newspapers they printed for other shops. He memorized names of reporters, recognized their styles. Some wrote like they were carving words into stone, formal and distant. Others wrote like they were telling stories in a saloon, immediate and rough. The boy preferred the second kind. Those writers made the city feel alive, made even small crimes or minor scandals seem worth attention. He began to imagine doing that. Not just setting other people's words, but writing his own. Not just assembling stories, but finding them. The idea felt both thrilling and impossible, like imagining a trip to the moon. Reporters came from different stock, educated men with connections, who knew which doors to knock on and what questions to ask. Still, the boy read. He practiced writing in the margins of spoiled sheets, copying the style of articles he admired. He taught himself grammar from the patterns he saw in print, learned punctuation by typesetting thousands of sentences. He studied how stories were built, the important facts first, the details after, the quotes that brought voices into the text. Henrik found him once, past midnight, reading by lamplight at the typecase. The printer said nothing, just shook his head and went back upstairs. But the next week, he brought down books. Not many. Henrik was not rich, but a few volumes bound in cracked leather. History, philosophy, collected essays. He set them on the boy's workbench without comment. The boy understood. This was permission, even encouragement. He read slowly, looking up words he did not know, working through arguments he barely grasped. The books showed him that the world was older and stranger than Chicago's 2 decades of existence. They showed him that people had always argued about justice and power, about who deserved what and why. Spring came to the city like a gradual warming, ice breaking in the river, mud appearing where snow had been. The boy walked to work through neighborhoods transforming themselves. New buildings replacing old, businesses opening and closing, the relentless churn of ambition and failure. Chicago never stood still. It built and burned and rebuilt, absorbed newcomers and spat out the unlucky, generated fortunes and casualties in equal measure. He was 17 years old, skilled in a trade, literate beyond his station, marked by ink and ambition. He did not yet know what he wanted to become, only that he wanted to become something. The city promised nothing except opportunity to try. That seemed like enough. The Herald's offices occupied the upper floors of a brick building on Madison Street, where the noise of the street never quite stopped rising through the floorboards. Horses, wagons, the shouting of vendors, the clang of construction, the city conducted its business in a permanent roar. The boy, now a man of 18, climbed the narrow stairs for the first time on a gray morning in spring, carrying a letter of introduction from Henrik. Jack Sterling, the editor, was a hard man with a cigarette perpetually burning between his fingers. His vest was stained with tobacco and coffee. His desk disappeared under layers of papers, tear sheets, galley proofs. He read Henrik's letter without looking up, then studied the young man standing before him. The examination lasted 30 seconds. "You can read?" "Yes, sir." "You can write?" "After a fashion." Sterling lit another cigarette from the dying ember of the first. "Henrik says you know type, says you're reliable. We have copy runners leave after 3 weeks because they're fools or they find better work. The pay is $12 a week. You'll start at 6 in the morning, fetching copy from reporters, carrying proof to the compositors, learning the flow of the building. If you're not useless after a month, we'll consider you for better work. If you waste my time, you're gone. Do you understand?" The young man understood perfectly. $12 a week was nearly 4 times what Henrik paid him. It meant he could rent a real room, buy decent clothes, save money faster. It meant something else, too. Entry into a world larger than print shops, into the machinery of newspapers, into the place where stories were born. He nodded. Sterling dismissed him with a gesture. "Malone will show you around. Don't touch anything unless someone tells you to touch it." The Herald was organized chaos. Reporters arrived and departed at random hours, carrying notebooks, muttering to themselves, arguing about leads. The copy desk occupied one corner, where veteran writers with green eye shades rewrote the raw material into publishable prose. The compositors worked in another room, surrounded by the click and clatter of typecases, assembling pages for the afternoon edition. Copy boys, for that was his title, ran between all of it, delivering manuscripts, collecting galleys, carrying messages. Malone was a veteran copy boy, nearly 30, who had never managed to become anything else. He showed the young man the building's geography, where the telegraph operator received dispatches from the wire services, where Sterling worked with the business manager, where the telegraph editor pieced together national and international stories. Malone showed him the basement where the presses ran, where the finished pages were locked into chases and run off by the thousands, where newsboys waited to carry bundles into the streets. "The trick," Malone said, lighting his own cigarette, "is to remember that this doesn't matter. Tomorrow's newspaper will line somebody's privy. You do the work clean, you stay out of trouble, you keep your eyes and ears open. That's the whole job." But the young man discovered almost immediately that Malone was wrong. It mattered intensely. The stories in the Herald shaped how people understood their city. A fire in a warehouse received one line. A fire in a tenement received 2 paragraphs with outraged language about building codes. An alderman was a public servant in one context and a corrupt functionary in another. The Herald's pages were not neutral. They reflected choices about what deserved attention and how it should be framed. He began to read everything, not just the printed product, but the raw copy before it was edited. He watched how the copy desk rewrote accounts, what they changed, and what they left intact. He noticed which reporters submitted careful, documented work and which seemed to publish rumors and speculation. He saw how certain stories about certain businesses never appeared at all, how certain aldermen received consistently favorable coverage. Officer Pete Donovan was a beat cop who worked the neighborhood around the stockyards. He came to the Herald offices once a week, delivering information to the police reporter. Donovan was an older man, probably 40, with a weathered face and tired eyes. Something about him suggested honesty, in a profession full of men who had learned to profit from their position. The young copy boy fetching coffee and delivering messages began to notice when Donovan appeared. He listened to the conversations, learned the texture of real police work versus the edited version that made it into print. One afternoon, Donovan caught him staring. "You interested in the actual job or just the wages?" The question felt like a test. "I'm interested in what's true." Donovan smiled, not kindly, but with something like recognition. "Then you picked the right newspaper and the wrong profession for it. This place publishes what sells papers, not what's true. Sometimes those are the same thing. Usually they aren't." He handed the young man a slip of paper with an address. "You want to know what's happening in this city? Come by the precinct house on Wednesday nights. I'll introduce you to people who actually know." The precinct house was a stone building that smelled of sweat and old coffee. Donovan introduced him to the other officers, to detectives working cases, to the patterns of Chicago's criminal underworld. The young man sat quietly, listening, understanding that his education was shifting from Henrik's books to the living city itself. Pete Donovan asked careful questions and showed him how investigation actually worked. Not revelation, but accumulation. Not sudden insight, but patient observation. He was promoted to reporting assistant after 2 months, which meant he covered minor stories under the supervision of established reporters. He attended small fires, police briefings, city council sessions. He learned to take notes quickly, to ask follow-up questions, to understand when a story was being hidden from him. He learned that much of reporting was simply showing up and paying attention to what others overlooked. The Stockyards district was where the city's wealth originated, and where its contradictions were most visible. Fortunes were made from cattle turned into packaged meat. Workers lost fingers and hands, contracted diseases, lived in neighborhoods that were themselves slowly poisoned by the work. The young reporter found stories everywhere. A worker crushed by machinery with no compensation. A foreman taking payoffs to ignore safety regulations. A neighborhood where the water made children sick. When he submitted one of these stories, carefully documented with multiple sources, Sterling edited it down by half. Names were removed. Specific claims were softened into vague accusations. The resulting piece was barely recognizable. The young reporter asked why. Sterling looked at him over the rim of his glasses. "Because I want to keep this newspaper in business," Sterling said. The stockyard owners advertise with us. The banks that finance the packing houses hold our notes. You think the world works according to facts? It works according to power. We print what we can print and still keep breathing. That's the compromise of this profession. The lesson landed hard. The young man had believed, despite evidence to the contrary, that truth had some independent weight, that facts, properly arranged, would matter. Sterling was telling him otherwise, that journalism was not about truth, but about what could be said within the margins of power. He did not accept this, but he learned to work within it. His byline appeared for the first time in late autumn of that year under a story about ineffective inspections at a factory. The words were modest, the implications carefully hedged, the claims documented beyond question, but it was his name. He saw it in print and felt something shift inside him. He had become the thing he imagined, not just an observer, but a voice, however small. Mary O'Brien worked as a seamstress in a shop near Madison Street. She was dark-haired, quick-witted, with hands that moved with practiced precision over fabric. The young reporter met her at a coffeehouse where journalists and printers often gathered. She was there with her sister, listening to the men argue about politics and business, with the patient attention of someone who knew they were not expected to join in. He found reasons to encounter her, then reasons to speak with her, then reasons to walk her home. She was skeptical of his ambitions, cautious about his moods, practical in a way that both attracted and frustrated him. She wanted a husband with steady work and regular hours, someone who came home at a predictable time and did not carry the stains of stories home with him. He could not imagine becoming that man. Even as they grew closer, walking along the lake on Sunday afternoons, sharing dinners at Mrs. Kowalski's, when Mary brought pastries her sister had made, he knew they were building something that would eventually break. His mind was elsewhere, in police briefings, in archives, in the margins of stories he was not allowed to publish. His obsession frightened her. "You're like a man with a fever," she told him once. "Always hot with something. Always turning the same thoughts over in your mind. You'll burn yourself out." "There's too much to know," he replied. "Too many stories that aren't being told." "And that's your responsibility?" He could not answer honestly. Yes, it felt like responsibility, but it also felt like obsession, like hunger that nothing satisfied. He would publish a story and immediately wonder what it missed, what remained hidden, what pressure had shaped it into acceptable form. By 22, he had bylines on perhaps 30 stories. Small pieces, mostly. A fire, a robbery, an interview with a businessman touting his new factory. Nothing that changed anything, nothing that required real courage. But he was learning the craft, understanding how to construct narrative, how to find sources, how to work within editorial constraints while maintaining integrity. He was learning the city by reporting its surface, seeing patterns that did not quite add up. Tommy, his old friend from the print shop, became a factory foreman and stopped crossing paths with him. Mrs. Kowalski's daughter married a bank clerk. Henrik's cough worsened until he began to move slowly, conserving energy. The city transformed around him even as he tried to document it. People entered his life and exited. Relationships that seemed permanent shifted into memory. Everyone was always moving, always climbing or falling, always heading somewhere else. The young reporter realized, in his 24th year, that he was building something the city might not want built, that his questions about how things actually worked, rather than how they appeared to work, made certain people uncomfortable. He received visits from men in good suits who offered friendly advice about focusing on lighter stories. He noticed that some assignments dried up, that certain editors no longer took his calls, that he had developed a reputation as difficult. Sterling called him into his office one afternoon and closed the door. "You're becoming a problem," the editor said, without preamble. "Not for me. I like reporters with teeth, but for the people who own this newspaper. There's been pressure, suggestions that your style of reporting is alienating important advertisers." "What style is that?" "Asking questions that powerful people don't want asked. You're good, which makes it worse. Your stories are documented and careful. You can't dismiss them easily. That makes them dangerous." The young man felt the trap closing. "So, I should stop?" Sterling lit a cigarette, took his time answering. "No, you should keep asking questions, but you should understand what that costs. There are limits to what even I can protect you from, and beyond this office there is no protection at all." The warning was clear. Ambition had a price. Integrity in journalism was possible only within narrow margins. The city would reward compliance and punish those who asked too many questions. The young reporter understood this intellectually. He was beginning to understand it in his bones. Mary left him in the spring of his 24th year. She married the bank clerk and moved to a neighborhood farther from the center of the city. He attended the wedding and watched her smile at a man who came home at predictable hours and never carried stories inside him. He did not blame her for choosing safety. He barely blamed himself for being unable to offer it. The Herald sent him to cover the labor disputes at the stockyards that summer, the ones that would eventually lead to violence and deaths. He was there as police clashed with strikers, as men and women and children were beaten for demanding better conditions. He filed careful reports that Sterling edited into something the newspaper could publish. What appeared in print bore little resemblance to what he had witnessed. The transformation was precise and devastating. Truth had been shaped into something acceptable. Standing in the composing room, watching his words transformed into type, then into finished pages, he understood finally what Sterling had been trying to teach him. Journalism was a craft of compromise, a dance performed for people with power. You could ask questions, but only the right ones. You could publish stories, but only stories that did not threaten the people who mattered. You could have integrity, but only the kind that fit within carefully maintained boundaries. He was 24 years old and already exhausted by the gap between what could be known and what could be said. He had become a writer, achieved his ambition, built a career in the trade he had imagined. But the city remained fundamentally unchanged. The same corruption continued. The same injustices persisted. His words had not altered anything except to make him slightly more conscious of his own irrelevance. He began to drink whiskey in the evenings, sitting at Sal Moretti's saloon near the precinct house, where Officer Donovan drank his own beer. He learned to play cards with other journalists, to listen to stories about investigations that never made it into print, to understand the underground geography of real information. He started to wonder what might be possible if he stopped accepting the newspaper's boundaries. What stories could be told if he was willing to pay the price for telling them? The question would wait. But it was forming, gathering weight, becoming the thing that would eventually remake him from a careful professional into something riskier and more interesting. Henrik died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, in his sleep. The landlady found him in the morning when he did not appear for breakfast. He had been coughing blood for weeks, though he never spoke of it, never sought a doctor. The young man came to the rooms above the print shop to find Henrik's body already prepared for burial, wrapped in a clean sheet, waiting for the arrangements that would consume the next several days. The funeral was small. A handful of Swedish immigrants, Mrs. Kowalski bringing soup, Officer Donovan paying respects to a man he had never met but understood to be significant. Sterling came, which surprised the young man, and stood silent through the service without offering condolences. The printer was buried in a cemetery north of the city, in a plot he had purchased years ago, perhaps always knowing how this would end. The rooms above the shop fell to the young man, along with Henrik's few possessions and the accumulated weight of gratitude. He had no legal claim to any of it, but the landlord, practical about such matters, accepted his rent payments and asked no questions. The young man moved into the space that had sheltered him through his formative years, surrounded by Henrik's books and Henrik's absence. He found the notebook while clearing out the desk. It was wedged into a false bottom beneath the second drawer, leather-bound and worn, the pages yellowed but still legible. The young man recognized the handwriting immediately, his father's. Not Henrik's careful Swedish script, but the precise clerk's hand he remembered from childhood, from papers scattered across a desk in a different life. His hands shook as he opened it. The entries were dated, beginning in 1868, 3 years before the Great Fire. His father had worked as a clerk in the land registry, processing property transfers, recording deed changes. The notebook was not a diary, but a log, meticulous and organized. It contained property descriptions, owners' names, dates of transfer. Beneath many of the entries were notations, question marks, brief queries in the margins, occasional underlined phrases that suggested doubt or concern. The young man read slowly, trying to reconstruct what his father had been investigating. A pattern emerged gradually. Properties listed as destroyed in the Great Fire that appeared in satellite documents to have been located outside the burn zone. Transfers of ownership that occurred in the chaos after the fire, moving parcels from original owners to new holders at fractions of their value. Names repeated across multiple transactions, names that had become familiar to the young man through years of reading newspapers. Aldermen, businessmen, lawyers whose firms handled the largest real estate operations in Chicago. His father had been assembling evidence of systematic fraud. The young man sat for hours in the dim room above the print shop, reading and rereading his father's careful annotations. He felt the presence of his father in every notation, every question mark, every piece of documentation. Henrik had known. The printer had harbored this evidence, preserved it, passed it indirectly to a boy who would eventually be old enough to understand its significance. Why had his father disappeared in 1871? The official account, such as it existed, suggested he had been lost in the fire itself. But the dates in the notebook continued until October 28th, 5 days after the fire. His father had been alive and working to document something after the fire started, something that mattered enough to risk. The young man understood, with a clarity that felt like sickness, that his father had been murdered. The realization reorganized everything. His childhood abandonment was not abandonment, but erasure. His father had not deserted him, but had been erased by people who benefited from the fire's chaos. The fire had not been random destruction, but opportunity for theft. The city's rebuilding had been built on fraud, and everyone involved had profited except the original property owners and the people like his father who threatened to expose it. He began visiting the City Hall archives during his free hours, cross-referencing his father's notes against public records. The work was meticulous and frustrating. Official documents had been lost or damaged in the fire. Many records existed only as references in other records. Tracing chains of ownership required connecting fragments, finding witnesses who remembered transactions, locating deed books that had been preserved. Benjamin Cole worked in the Hall of Records, an elderly clerk who had been there before the fire and returned afterward. He remembered the chaos of 1871, the frantic shuffling of papers, the decisions made about what to preserve and what to let burn. When the young man approached him with careful questions about specific properties, Cole studied him with sudden attention. "You're asking about the fraud," Cole said quietly. It was not a question. "I'm asking about property transfers. That's the same thing." There were men who came in during the confusion, after the fire, with documents claiming they owned parcels that burned. The papers looked official, the signatures appeared legitimate. But I remember some of those properties. They didn't burn. They were south of the fire line, in areas that were only touched by smoke. Cole glanced around the archive room, making sure they were not observed. "Your father was a clerk here. He noticed things. He started asking questions. Then he was gone. There was a story about the fire taking him, but I never believed it." "What happened to him?" Cole's face tightened. "I don't know. But I know he was making powerful men uncomfortable. I know that in 1871, making powerful men uncomfortable was a dangerous thing to do. More dangerous than now, if that's possible." The young man left the archive with more questions than answers. He had confirmed that his father had been investigating real fraud, had been documenting real crimes. The fact that his father was now dead suggested that the crimes were serious enough to justify murder. He began approaching this investigation as journalism, though he had not yet decided whether or how to publish. He conducted interviews carefully, presenting himself as a reporter interested in the fire's history. He spoke with architects who had assessed fire damage, builders who had contracted to reconstruct, inspectors who had processed permits. He listened for inconsistencies, for stories that contradicted official accounts, for evidence of systematic manipulation. The names in his father's notebook appeared repeatedly. Thomas Carver, an alderman now, had been a young lawyer in 1871, representing several property owners in transfer negotiations. Catherine Wheeler, a widow of considerable wealth, had acquired 3 properties after the fire through quick transactions with men whose names appeared in the notebook. Vincent Shaw, a businessman who now controlled several blocks of real estate, had represented himself as an agent for absentee owners during the Reconstruction period. The reporter began to understand the architecture of the fraud. During the fire's chaos, corrupt officials and their associates had moved quickly to acquire properties at depressed prices. Owners fled the city or lost everything. The associations between properties and original owners became confused. New owners filed claims with insurance companies, often receiving payouts for losses they had not actually incurred. The fire had been a window of opportunity that certain men had exploited systematically. Carver drew the young man's particular attention. The alderman was rising in power, accumulating influence and wealth with suspicious speed. Carver had served on committees that approved building permits for reconstruction. Carver had connections to the city's most powerful businessmen. Carver's fingers appeared to be in every profitable transaction related to the fire's aftermath. The reporter began to ask questions about Carver's holdings, his connections, his activities in 1871. He attended Carver's public appearances, listened to his speeches about Chicago's recovery and resilience. The contradiction was remarkable. Carver spoke with genuine conviction about rebuilding the city, while simultaneously appearing to have looted it during its moment of greatest vulnerability. A man approached him outside Sal Moretti's saloon on a cold evening in late November. The man was well-dressed, polite, utterly threatening. "You should stop asking questions about property transfers," the man said, "for your own safety." "I'm just researching the fire's history." "No, you're not. You're researching Thomas Carver. You're doing it quietly, carefully, in a way that suggests you know something. Stop. This is the only warning you'll receive." The man disappeared before the young reporter could formulate a response. But the message was clear. His investigation had been noticed. Powerful people were aware of his questions. His careful approach had not been careful enough. He moved the notebook to a new hiding place, in the walls of the print shop itself, behind a loose brick near the stove. He kept careful copies of his notes in a locked box hidden in a separate location. He understood that he was playing a dangerous game, but he could not stop. The investigation had become personal in a way that transcended journalism. His father's murder, patient and methodical across the years, had become the young man's responsibility. Rose Delacroix sang at a gentleman's club on South Michigan Avenue. She was a singer of considerable talent and reputation. Beautiful in a way that suggested she had learned to use beauty as currency. The reporter's sources, Sal Moretti and Officer Donovan both, suggested that Rose had been the mistress of Thomas Carver for several years before a bitter separation. He approached her after a performance in December, introducing himself as a journalist with questions about property ownership in the post-fire era. She studied him with a careful assessment of someone who had learned to judge character quickly. "You're investigating Carver." "Why would you think that?" "Because no one asks questions about property in 1871 unless they're investigating Carver. Because he made money that year, and he did it by stealing. Because I was there, in his house, watching him celebrate while families lost everything." She paused. "And because you have the look of someone who's already paid a price for asking." They began meeting in careful locations, always public, always with escape routes. Rose confirmed details the reporter had suspected. Carver's systematic acquisition of property, his connections to the insurance commissioners who approved fraudulent claims, his partnership with other men who had similarly profited from the fire. She provided names, details, dates. She confirmed that Carver had been involved in activities during the fire that suggested more than simple opportunism, violence, intimidation, possibly murder. "He told me about your father," Rose said one afternoon, sitting in a coffee house far from her usual haunts. It was years later, after drink. He said a clerk had been making problems, asking questions about deeds and transfers. He said the man had to be dealt with. He didn't use those words exactly, but the meaning was clear. There was another man who did it, someone Carver knew, someone who understood how to handle such problems. Your father was disappeared during the fire, and everyone assumed the fire had taken him. The reporter felt rage and sorrow in equal measure, emotions so intense they felt almost physical. His father had been murdered by people still alive, still operating, still profiting from the crime. The murder had gone unpunished, forgotten, absorbed into the fire's general devastation. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because he broke my heart," Rose said simply. "Because he lied to me and used me and treated me like a possession. Because I watched him become wealthy and respected while families like yours were destroyed. Because I'm tired of carrying the knowledge alone." But Rose's help came with a price. She began to receive pressure herself, visits from men who warned her about speaking to journalists. She started to look frightened, though she continued to meet him. Their encounters became more hurried, less safe. The reporter understood that in helping him, she was putting herself in genuine danger. The editor Sterling called him into his office in late January. "I know what you're working on," Sterling said without preamble. "The Carver investigation, the property fraud. I also know that you haven't written a word of it for the Herald." "I don't have enough yet." "Yes, you do. You have enough to publish something. But you're waiting for something else. You're waiting for perfect evidence, complete proof, something that can't be dismissed or attacked. That's not how journalism works. You publish what you know and let the facts accumulate afterward. Or the newspaper gets sued for libel. Probably. But that's my decision to make, not yours. The question is, do you want to publish this story? The reporter understood the weight of the question. Publishing meant abandoning his pretense of detachment. It meant identifying himself as a threat to powerful men. It meant accepting that his life was going to change in fundamental ways. "I need to be absolutely certain first," he said. "I need to understand who killed my father. I need to know how deep this goes." Sterling nodded, as if he had expected this answer. "Then understand this. The longer you investigate quietly, the more dangerous it becomes. Carver and his associates know you're asking questions. They'll eventually decide that stopping you is cheaper than allowing you to continue. When that happens, quiet investigation becomes an active liability." The warning echoed the earlier threat. The young reporter was approaching a threshold beyond which the nature of the game would change. He could withdraw, accept the boundary that powerful men had established, return to publishing stories about fires and strikes and minor crimes. Or he could cross the threshold and accept the consequences. He thought about his father, about Henrik, about the fraud that had been quietly stealing from Chicago's citizens for decades. He thought about Rose putting herself at risk. He thought about the families who had lost everything while Carver and his associates prospered. He kept his notebooks and began compiling his research into a coherent whole. He prepared a detailed memorandum documenting what he believed he could prove, the gaps in his evidence, the people who could corroborate various claims. He distributed copies to trusted people: Officer Donovan, Benjamin Cole, Sterling himself. He understood that once the investigation became widely known, his physical safety might depend on that distribution. Murder was less likely if multiple people held the evidence. By the end of February, as snow melted and the Chicago spring began its tentative arrival, the reporter understood that he had become committed to something larger than himself. He had inherited his father's investigation and made it his own. What would happen next remained unknown, but the trajectory was set. He had asked questions that powerful men did not want asked, and there would be a price for continuing. He was 25 years old, orphaned, alone, and carrying knowledge that could destroy men, or get him killed. The city around him continued its indifferent rebuilding, its relentless transformation. But beneath the surface, beneath the official narratives of progress and prosperity, something darker was beginning to surface. The foundation upon which Chicago had been rebuilt was starting to crack. The World's Columbian Exposition opened in May of 1893, transforming the lakefront south of the city into something that belonged to no earthly geography. The White City, people called it, vast neoclassical buildings arranged around lagoons and plazas, electric lights strung across gardens and promenades, the future made visible and tangible. 27 million people would pass through its gates over the next 6 months. Chicago had become a destination, a place where the world came to witness American ambition made manifest. The reporter moved through the fair like a man conducting reconnaissance behind enemy lines. On the surface, he was a journalist, documenting the spectacle, filing occasional pieces about the architecture and the crowds and the inventions on display. In reality, he was hunting. The chaos of the fair provided cover. The crowds offered anonymity. The constant flow of money and influence created opportunities for observation that would have been impossible in the city's more ordered spaces. James Finch was an architect who had worked on several of the fair's buildings. He was in his 50s, competent and respected, with the careful manner of someone who had navigated professional politics successfully. The reporter approached him at a reception for the exposition's designers, introduced himself as a journalist interested in the fair's construction, and asked intelligent questions that suggested genuine knowledge of building practice. Finch responded with cautious enthusiasm, seeing in the young man an opportunity to discuss the technical complexities of rapid construction on an unprecedented scale. Over several meetings, walking between the fair's buildings, the reporter gradually shifted his questions toward the post-fire reconstruction. How had permits been processed during the chaos after 1871? What mechanisms had existed to verify that rebuilding was actually replacing what had been destroyed? How did inspectors confirm that new structures were appropriate to their locations? The questions appeared academic, interested in historical process rather than criminal conduct. The period after the fire was anarchic, Finch explained as they stood before the transportation building, its golden doors reflecting the afternoon sun. There were almost no controls. The city was desperate to rebuild. A man with money and connections could construct almost anything, anywhere. Inspectors were overwhelmed, often corrupt themselves, willing to approve work that should have been rejected. The whole process was structured to enable fraud. Did that concern you? Finch glanced at him, recognizing something in the question's precision. It concerned many of us, but we were young, trying to build careers. You don't make problems for powerful men when you're trying to establish yourself. You notice what you notice, you keep quiet, and you move forward. It's the calculus of survival in this profession. And the people who were harmed were numerous and powerless, Finch said quietly. That's the calculus that mattered then. It still matters now. The reporter filed this away, another piece of confirmation that the fraud had been systematic and widely understood among those in position to stop it. The silence of competent people was not innocence, but complicity. The fair itself was built partially on stolen land, on the profits of corruption, on a foundation that included murder. Thomas Carver attended several functions at the exposition. The reporter watched him move through crowds, greeting the city's prominent men, accepting congratulations on Chicago's progress. Carver had aged well. His face was distinguished rather than hard, his manner assured without appearing arrogant. He could have been a senator, a judge, a president. He had the bearing of success, the confidence of a man who had beaten the world's resistance through superior will and intelligence. The reporter understood, with sudden clarity, that Carver did not believe what he had done was wrong. The alderman had not stolen property during the fire's chaos, despite moral reservations. He had done it because the opportunity existed, and because the world, in his estimation, belonged to those clever enough to seize it. Carver's morality was not inverted, but simply absent, replaced by a pure calculus of power and profit. One evening, walking alone through the fair after closing, the reporter was intercepted by two men who had been following him for several blocks. They were large, competent, and professional. They did not say anything, simply appeared on either side of him and guided him toward a darker section of the grounds where fewer visitors lingered. The violence was efficient and deliberate. Ribs, not head, injuries that would hurt but not permanently disable. The work of men who had been taught to calibrate damage carefully. When they finished, one of them spoke. "Carver's patience has limits. This is the last warning. Stop investigating, or stop living. Your choice." The reporter lay on the ground for perhaps 10 minutes before he could stand. His ribs sang with pain when he moved. His face was unmarked. They had been careful about that, too. He limped back to his boarding house and sat in the dark, understanding that the line between investigation and danger had been irreversibly crossed. He did not go to the police. Donovan would have wanted to help, but the assault would have complicated everything, bringing official attention that could disrupt the careful work. Instead, he sat with his pain and understood that he had become a genuine threat. Carver was no longer simply defending his past, but actively attacking the present. The investigation had escalated from cold research to hot conflict. Sterling listened to his account without interrupting. The editor studied the reporter's bruised face and the careful way he held himself. Carver? Carver's people. Then the Herald can't publish anything now. It would look like retaliation, like we're part of a vendetta. Anything we print will be dismissed as the work of a beaten man trying to hurt his attackers. Sterling lit his cigarette. But this also means we need to move forward. If Carver's willing to break bones, he's afraid. He wouldn't attack if he thought you were harmless. The attack itself is evidence that you're close to something real. I'm not close enough. I don't have proof that Carver killed my father. I have suspicions and circumstantial evidence. Then you get proof, or you accept that some crimes remain unpunished. That's the reality of this work. Justice is not guaranteed. Truth is not inevitable. Sometimes the guilty escape, and the innocent remain unavenged. The reporter understood Sterling was giving him permission to stop, to step back from the investigation and preserve his physical integrity. But stopping was no longer possible, not after being beaten, not after understanding viscerally that powerful men were willing to injure him to maintain their secrets. The attack had transformed the investigation from intellectual exercise into personal necessity. He began staying in different boarding houses, moving every few days to avoid establishing a pattern. He gave copies of his research to multiple people: Donovan, Benjamin Cole, Sterling, a lawyer he trusted. He understood that if something happened to him, the investigation needed to survive independently. His death would not erase the evidence, would not protect Carver, might actually accelerate the story's emergence. Officer Pete Donovan was promoted to detective in the fall of 1893, moving into a role where his influence and trustworthiness could operate across the city's criminal investigations. The reporter began working with Donovan more openly now, providing information about Carver and his associates in exchange for police protection and access to official records. The arrangement was unofficial, existing in the margins of proper procedure, but it represented a crucial alliance. "Carver's got friends in the department," Donovan warned. "Men who owe him favors or receive money from him directly. I can't protect you from all of them, but I can watch out for what I can see." The reporter understood the limitation. He was dependent on the goodwill of one honest man in an institution shot through with corruption. That goodwill was valuable, but not absolute. It could not protect him from everything. Rose was living more carefully now, aware that her association with the reporter had made her visible to people who preferred invisibility. She had left Carver's world, but not entirely. She still sang at the same club, still moved through the same social circles, still possessed access to information that could help the investigation. But she was frightened in a way she had not been before, glancing over her shoulder, changing her routes home. "I've been receiving visits," she told the reporter during one of their increasingly rare meetings. "Men who suggest that my future depends on not being helpful to certain journalists. Men who remind me that my reputation is fragile and could be destroyed easily. They're not threatening directly, but the implication is clear. You should stop helping me." "I know. I'm going to, eventually. But not yet. I need to believe that what happened to me, what Carver did to me, matters enough to expose. I need to believe that my pain has a purpose beyond his entertainment." The reporter wanted to tell her it was not worth the risk, that no story was worth her safety. But he also understood that she had already made her choice. She would help until the danger became unbearable, and then she would stop. In the meantime, her testimony would continue to be crucial. By the end of 1893, the reporter had assembled a comprehensive picture of the fraud. He could document specific properties, trace them through multiple ownership changes, show how insurance claims had been paid for properties that had not actually been destroyed, prove that certain city officials had approved permits for buildings on land that did not belong to the applicants. What he could not absolutely prove was that Thomas Carver had orchestrated the entire scheme, or that Carver had personally ordered his father's death. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. He was 30 years old now, no longer young, marked by the investigation in ways that showed on his face and in the careful way he moved through the city. His apartment contained nothing but his research and his books. He had no romantic connections, no ordinary social life, no future that extended beyond the next phase of the investigation. He was a man consumed by purpose by obsession, by the need to extract justice from a system designed to prevent it. During the winter of 1893 and 1894, he conducted interviews with dozens of people: property owners who had been defrauded, insurance adjusters who had been pressured to approve fraudulent claims, city clerks who had been ordered to process irregular documents. He built a network of sources that extended from the highest levels of city government to the poorest immigrant neighborhoods. Everyone had a story about corruption following the fire, about wealth being extracted from disaster, about power protecting power. The reporter documented everything: names, dates, amounts, connections. He prepared multiple copies of his research and distributed them carefully. He wrote detailed summaries that Sterling could reference if something happened to him. He created a structure of redundancy, designed to ensure that if one copy was destroyed, others survived. In March of 1894, Sterling agreed to begin publishing the investigation as a series. "We'll start carefully," the editor cautioned. "Hints rather than accusations, questions rather than answers. We'll let the evidence accumulate gradually. If we move too fast, Carver and his associates will have time to organize a legal response before we can publish everything. If we move methodically, the public story will gain momentum before they can stop it." The reporter understood the strategy. It was journalism as chess, calculating moves several steps in advance, understanding that the publication of truth was not simply a matter of accuracy, but of timing, presentation, and strategic advantage. The first article appeared on a Sunday in April, buried in the middle pages, a piece about irregularities in property transfers following the Great Fire. It was careful, hedged with qualifications, documented with specific examples, but no names initially. The piece posed questions. How had some properties transferred ownership so quickly? Why had buildings been approved for construction in locations that seemed inconsistent with the fire's path? Were there mechanisms for oversight that had failed? The public response was limited. A few readers wrote letters to the editor expressing interest. City officials issued statements defending the post-fire reconstruction process. No one seemed particularly alarmed. But in certain circles, the article created tremors. Carver's associates began making telephone calls. Lawyers sent letters to Sterling threatening libel action. Pressure was applied through various channels: advertising cancellations, suggestions to major creditors that the Herald was becoming an unstable business partner. The newspaper was being tested, its commitment to the story being measured. Sterling held firm. A week later, the second article appeared, slightly more specific, containing actual names now, though still carefully filtered through questions and implications, rather than direct accusations. The pattern of fraud began to emerge more clearly. Readers started to understand that something systematic had occurred, that powerful people had profited from disaster. Carver himself responded in a public speech, defending the post-fire reconstruction as a triumph of American enterprise and courage. He attacked the Herald for attempting to diminish Chicago's achievements through cynical scrutiny. He called the newspaper's series irresponsible and inflammatory, suggesting that it was motivated by personal vendetta rather than concern for truth. The response only amplified the story. Other newspapers began covering the Herald's investigation, some sympathetically, some critically. The question of post-fire fraud became a public debate, something discussed in saloons and boardrooms, in immigrant tenements and wealthy mansions. The reporter realized that the investigation had acquired momentum beyond his control. It had become a story that the city was telling itself about itself. By summer, the narrative had solidified. There had been systematic fraud following the Great Fire. Powerful men had profited. The city's corruption had deep roots extending from the fire itself to the present. Whether Carver would face consequences remained unclear. But the story existed now, outside his ability to suppress it, available to anyone interested in understanding how Chicago actually worked. The reporter stood one evening at the edge of Lake Michigan, watching the sun descend toward the horizon, and felt something like satisfaction. The investigation had not been perfect. Many crimes would remain unpunished. The fraud would be partially exposed but not fully prosecuted. But the truth had emerged, had been documented, had been published. The city could no longer pretend innocence about its foundation. He did not know then how much would still be required of him, how many more dangers remained, how the investigation would ultimately transform his life in ways he could not yet anticipate. He only knew that something had shifted. The stones of the city's foundation had been turned over. Whatever lay beneath would eventually be forced into light. The ledger arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in plain paper, left at the Herald's front desk with instructions that it be delivered to the reporter. There was no note, no explanation, only the leather-bound book itself, with its pages filled with careful accounting. Rose had risked everything to acquire it. The reporter understood immediately what he was holding. This was the proof that had eluded him, the documentation that transformed suspicion into certainty. The ledger contained Thomas Carver's private financial records, payments received, payments made, properties acquired, insurance claims processed, bribes distributed. It was the skeleton key that opened every locked door in the investigation. The entries dated from 1870 to 1875, the crucial years of post-fire reconstruction. Carver's handwriting was meticulous, his accounting precise. Each line itemized transactions with businesslike clarity. Property on Michigan Avenue, insurance claim approved, split with Commissioner Walsh, $5,000. Permit issued for warehouse construction, payment to Alderman Brennan, $2,000. Deed transfer finalized. Original owner paid $300, resold to investor for $12,000. The reporter sat in Sterling's office while the editor studied the ledger page by page. Sterling's face grew darker as he read, understanding the magnitude of what they possessed. This was not inference or circumstantial evidence. This was Carver's own admission, documented in his own hand, cataloging crimes across years and transactions. "This is extraordinary," Sterling said finally. "This is the kind of evidence that ends careers, that results in prosecutions, that changes everything." "It's also potentially worthless," the reporter replied. "Carver will claim forgery. He'll argue the ledger was fabricated, that I created it to damage him. He'll attack the source. And legally, we may not be able to use it without establishing an unbroken chain of custody." "Where did it come from?" "I can't say." Sterling understood the implication. The ledger had come from someone close to Carver, someone with access to his private records. That someone was likely in profound danger. If the ledger's source was revealed, that person would be exposed to Carver's retribution. The reporter's refusal to identify the source was not obstinacy, but protection. "Rose," Sterling said quietly. The reporter did not confirm or deny, but his silence was answer enough. "Then we move carefully and quickly," Sterling continued. "We verify what we can verify against public records. We prepare the story for publication, and we pray that Carver doesn't realize what Rose has done before we go to print." The verification process consumed weeks. The reporter cross-referenced every entry in the ledger against city records, insurance company files, property deed transfers. What emerged was a comprehensive map of the fraud. Properties that had been defrauded of their ownership during the post-fire chaos. Insurance claims that had been paid for losses that did not occur. Permits that had been issued for construction on land that did not belong to the applicants. The ledger revealed something else, that Carver had not acted alone. Other names appeared repeatedly: aldermen, businessmen, insurance commissioners, city clerks. A network of corruption that extended far beyond Carver himself, implicating dozens of men in various levels of conspiracy. The fraud had been systematic and coordinated, involving the cooperation of people throughout the city's administrative apparatus. Most devastatingly, the ledger contained a single entry that addressed the reporter's father directly. Dated October 28, 1871. Clerk Cole, problem resolved by Finney. Payment $1,000. Cole had been his father's surname. The reporter realized, with a feeling of sickness and finality, that he was looking at the documentation of his father's murder. Carver had paid someone named Finney to kill the clerk who had been investigating the fraud. The reporter brought this entry to Officer Donovan. "Can you find Finney?" Donovan studied the line carefully. "If he existed in 1871 and was paid to do violence, he's either dead or in prison or out of the city. It's been more than 20 years. People involved in that kind of work either get caught or they disappear. But you can try?" "I can try. But I'm warning you, even if we find him, his testimony is worthless now. A man admitting to murder for hire after 2 decades? No court would take it seriously. And Carver would deny the whole thing, claim the ledger is fabricated, claim you created this entry yourself." The reporter understood the limitation. Justice had rules, procedures, requirements for proof that did not match the messy reality of crime. Carver had committed murder in 1871 with complete confidence that the deed would remain hidden. 2 decades of secrecy would make prosecution nearly impossible, even with the ledger as evidence. Still, something had shifted. The reporter now possessed absolute confirmation that his father had been murdered. He knew the mechanism: payment to a man named Finney. He knew the motive: his father's investigation of the fraud. The knowledge was not equivalent to justice, but it was something. It was truth. It was the answer to a question that had haunted him since childhood. He visited Benjamin Cole at the Hall of Records and shared the ledger entry with the old clerk. Cole read it slowly, understanding its significance. "Your father was a good man," Cole said quietly. "He asked questions because he believed the questions mattered. That's why they killed him." Do you know who Finney was? Cole thought for a long time. There was a man, a fixer of sorts, who handled certain problems for important people. He was good at making people disappear, making problems vanish. I never knew his full name or where he was from, but I remember hearing he'd gone west after the fire, California or somewhere remote. If it's the same Finney, he'd be an old man now, if he's alive at all. The reporter filed this away. Finding Finney was probably impossible, but the information might be useful later. For now, the priority was publishing the ledger's revelations before Carver realized what had happened. Sterling began preparing the story for publication. He arranged meetings with the Herald's lawyer, verifying that they had adequate legal standing to publish the ledger contents and the accompanying accusations. The lawyer was nervous about the magnitude of the exposure, worried about libel claims and the power of the men who would be implicated. "They can sue us," the lawyer cautioned. "They absolutely can sue us. And they can bring pressure through various channels, advertisers, creditors, city officials. This story will put the Herald itself at risk." Sterling listened without argument. He understood the stakes, but he had decided that the story was worth the risk. The investigation had accumulated enough evidence, enough corroboration, enough public momentum that suppression was no longer viable. The choice was between publishing a comprehensive account or allowing the conspiracy to continue its cover-up. "We publish," Sterling said. "We prepare for lawsuits. We document everything meticulously. And we pray that the public reaction is strong enough that the men involved will find prosecution preferable to endless litigation." Rose was living in a small apartment in a neighborhood far from her usual haunts. She was aware that her window of safety was closing. Carver would eventually understand that she had stolen the ledger. When that understanding arrived, her life would change dramatically. The reporter met her one final time before the story was published. They sat in a coffee house on a side street in the afternoon when crowds were minimal. Rose looked exhausted, as if she had aged years in the months since providing the ledger. "You should leave the city," the reporter said. "Go somewhere Carver's influence doesn't extend. The East Coast or Europe even. You have the resources." "I'm staying," Rose replied. "Not out of courage, out of stubbornness. I spent years allowing him to define my life. I'm finished doing that. Carver will destroy you if he realizes what you've done. He'll try, but you're going to publish the story before he has time to organize an effective response. The newspaper will protect me, won't it? Once the ledger is public, attacking me becomes attacking the Herald, becomes attacking the investigation." The reporter wanted to promise her safety, but he could not. Carver was dangerous, and revenge would be a priority once the businessman understood Rose's betrayal. But the reporter also understood Rose's reasoning. She had chosen agency over protection, had decided to act rather than be acted upon. "The story publishes next Sunday," the reporter said. "After that, you'll be part of the public record, part of the investigation. That provides some protection. And if it doesn't, then you leave immediately. You go to the railroad station and you buy a ticket and you don't look back. You have enough money to start over." Rose nodded. She understood the contingency as well as he did. The Herald's offices were tense during the week before publication. Word had leaked somehow that a major story was being prepared. Carver's lawyers sent letters threatening massive libel suits. The city's aldermen sent delegations requesting postponement. Pressure came from multiple directions. Business associates threatening to withdraw advertising. Bank representatives suggesting that the Herald's credit might be affected. Influential citizens writing letters to Sterling urging caution. Sterling rejected all of it. He had committed to the story. The preparation continued. On Saturday night, the reporter stood in the composing room and watched his words being set into type. Years of investigation. Decades of waiting for justice. His father's murder, finally being addressed in print. The metal letters assembled slowly, building sentences, accumulating into accusations that could not be taken back once they appeared in the Sunday edition. By midnight, the composing was complete. By 2 a.m, the printing began. The press thundered through the night, running off copies of the Herald with the headline, "The Fire That Never Ended. Systematic Fraud in Chicago's Post-Disaster Reconstruction," and a detailed accounting of property fraud, insurance manipulation, and official corruption extending from 1871 to the present. The reporter did not sleep. He sat in the newspaper offices as dawn broke, watching the streets fill with newsboys, watching the first editions being distributed, watching the city begin to absorb what had been published. The response was immediate and intense. By midday Sunday, the Herald's telephone lines were overwhelmed. Every important person in Chicago had read the story or heard about it. The accounts published in the ledger entries were being discussed in saloons and mansions, in factories and government offices. The questions the Herald had been posing in recent weeks suddenly had answers. The accusations suddenly had documentation. Carver responded with a public statement denying everything. He claimed the ledger was a forgery, fabricated by enemies to damage his reputation. He called the Herald's investigation a vendetta disguised as journalism, the work of people motivated by personal animus rather than concern for truth. He announced that he would be filing the largest libel suit in the city's history. But the ledger was devastating. Even as Carver denied its authenticity, people compared his denials against the actual entries. The handwriting appeared to be his. The details were too specific to be invented. The connection between the ledger entries and subsequent property ownership was too precise to be coincidence. Benjamin Cole publicly testified to the Herald that the ledger's account was consistent with what he had observed during the post-fire period. Officer Donovan confirmed that other ledger entries matched police records of crimes and permits. Insurance company officials acknowledged that claims referenced in the ledger had indeed been paid. The accretion of corroboration made denying the ledger's authenticity increasingly difficult. Within 48 hours, 3 of the men implicated in the ledger had resigned from their positions. Within a week, federal prosecutors had begun investigating. Within 2 weeks, lawyers representing various conspiracy members began negotiating with the Herald about what could be published without resulting in successful libel suits. But something else had happened as well. Rose had disappeared. Carver had discovered her involvement before the story was even published. On Sunday morning, a few hours after the Herald hit the streets, men came to her apartment. She was not home, had apparently left during the night, leaving behind only a note for the reporter. "I'm going east. I'll be safe. Thank you for believing me." The reporter understood that Rose had anticipated Carver's response and had prepared her escape in advance. She had given the ledger to the Herald, then immediately booked passage on a train. By the time Carver realized her betrayal, she was beyond his reach, heading toward New York and a new life. Officer Donovan brought the reporter a message. Carver was planning to have him killed. The threat was not vague or hedged, but specific and credible. Carver had given orders to have the reporter eliminated, to remove the primary author of the investigation before the investigation could proceed further. "You need to disappear," Donovan said bluntly. "Not for a few days, for months, until this blows over or until Carver is prosecuted." The reporter considered the option. He could leave Chicago, travel to another city, wait for the investigation to conclude. But leaving felt like abandonment, like betraying his father's memory and the work that was barely beginning. "I'm not leaving," he said. "Then I'll keep you alive," Donovan replied. "But you're going to do exactly what I say when I say it. You're going to stay in places I designate. You're going to avoid patterns. And you're going to understand that this is serious. Carver has killed before. He'll kill again, if given the opportunity." So the reporter entered a new phase of his life, becoming a man in hiding, moving between safe houses, changing locations constantly, avoiding anywhere he might be predictable. Sterling kept him employed at the Herald, but modified his work so that his location was never certain. The investigation continued, but now it continued with the reporter as its primary target. The ledger had transformed everything. The fraud was no longer a historical question, but an active prosecution. The conspiracy was no longer a theory, but an established fact, being investigated by federal authorities. Carver's empire was beginning to crumble, not quickly, but inexorably, like a structure whose foundation has been revealed as corrupt. But the reporter understood that Carver was dangerous precisely because he was losing. Desperate men were more violent than confident ones. The investigation had succeeded in making the truth public, but it had also made the reporter's life precarious in new and immediate ways. He was safe only as long as he remained invisible, only as long as he made himself an impossible target. The courthouse on Clark Street was built of marble and certainty, designed to project permanence and justice. On the morning the trial began, the reporter sat in the gallery behind the prosecution's table, watching Thomas Carver enter with his lawyers, 3 men in expensive suits who carried briefcases like weapons. Carver looked diminished somehow, his earlier confidence compressed into something harder and more defensive. The man who had controlled Chicago's post-fire reconstruction now sat in the defendant's chair, stripped of authority, subject to procedures he could not manipulate. Federal prosecutors had brought charges against Carver and 8 other men implicated in the ledger: conspiracy, fraud, extortion, receiving bribes. The case was being tried before Judge Cornelius Bram, a man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness that transcended the usual political calculations. Bram had been appointed by a Republican administration and had managed to offend neither Democrats nor the city's most powerful interests through a judicious balance of competence and neutrality. The Herald's lawyer had secured a seat for the reporter because he was listed as a key witness. For weeks, he had prepared testimony about the investigation's methodology, about how he had accumulated evidence, about the ledger's authenticity. But testimony was weeks away. First came opening arguments, then the prosecution's case, then the mountain of documents and witnesses that would build the foundation for conviction. The prosecutor was a man named Samuel Greenberg, a federal official who had traveled to Chicago specifically to handle the case. Greenberg was competent and methodical, building his argument piece by piece, calling witnesses who established the context of post-fire reconstruction, who explained how property fraud had been possible, who documented specific transactions that violated the law. Benjamin Cole testified about the chaos at the Hall of Records after the fire, about the pressure to process permits quickly, about the ways that documentation had been altered or falsified. The old clerk sat with perfect posture, speaking clearly, answering questions with the precision of a man who had worked in bureaucracy his entire life. Greenberg's strategy was to establish that fraud had been systematic and widespread, that it had been possible only through the cooperation of officials at multiple levels. Insurance company officials testified about claims that had been paid for properties that had not actually been destroyed. City engineers testified about permits that had been issued for construction on land that did not belong to the applicants. Bank officers testified about transactions that appeared to involve circular transfers of money designed to conceal the original source of funds. The accumulation was methodical and damning. Each witness provided a piece of the larger pattern. Each piece seemed small in isolation, but devastating when assembled into the whole. Carver's lawyers cross-examined aggressively, trying to create doubt, to suggest alternative explanations, to attack the credibility of witnesses. But the lawyers were fighting a losing battle against the weight of documentation. When the ledger itself was entered as evidence, the courtroom fell silent. Judge Bram studied the leather-bound book carefully, then allowed Greenberg to read selected entries into the record. Carver's own handwriting, his own documentation, his own words becoming testimony against him. Carver's defense was built on three foundations. The ledger was a forgery, created by enemies to damage him. The reporter was motivated by personal vendetta rather than concern for truth. And even if certain irregularities had occurred, they did not constitute criminal conspiracy, but were simply the normal business practices of the era. The reporter listened to this argument with something approaching fascination. Carver was arguing that fraud had been acceptable, that the standards of morality had been different after the fire, that men who had taken advantage of chaos had simply been acting according to the expectations of the time. It was a defense that acknowledged guilt while denying culpability, that accepted the facts while rejecting their interpretation. The reporter was called to testify near the end of the prosecution's case. He sat in the witness box and answered Greenberg's questions about his investigation, how he had discovered the notebook in Henrik's rooms, how he had cross-referenced entries against public records, how he had interviewed sources and accumulated documentation. Greenberg was systematic, building the reporter's credibility, establishing that the investigation had been thorough and careful. The cross-examination was brutal. Carver's lead attorney, a man named Vincent Morse, attacked the reporter's methodology, his motivations, his interpretations. Morse suggested that the reporter had created the ledger himself, had fabricated entries, had built a false narrative to damage an innocent man. Morse pointed out that the reporter had personal reasons for vendetta, the murder of his father, the vague belief that Carver bore responsibility for it. "You were orphaned," Morse said, not as a question but as an accusation. "You were taken in by a printer. You grew up with nothing, while men like Mr. Carver succeeded. Is it not possible that your investigation was driven by envy rather than principle? It was driven by evidence, the reporter replied carefully, by documents, by sources, by the accumulation of fact. My personal circumstances did not create the fraud. The fraud existed before I became interested in it. But your interest in it was driven by personal motivation. Yes, my father's murder was personal. But the fraud is documented. Personal motivation does not invalidate factual documentation. Morse pressed harder, trying to create reasonable doubt, to suggest that the reporter's personal obsessions had distorted his judgment. The attorney was skilled and persistent, finding the weaknesses in testimony, exploiting ambiguities, constructing alternative narratives that seemed plausible within the logic of his own presentation. But the reporter had been cross-examined by life more thoroughly than he could be cross-examined by any lawyer. He answered with the calm of a man who had nothing left to lose, who had already paid prices and survived them. His testimony survived Morse's assault. The defense called its own witnesses, men who testified that property transfers had been normal and properly documented, businessmen who testified that Carver had been an honest operator, city officials who testified that permits had been issued according to correct procedures. Each defense witness was carefully chosen to create doubt, to establish an alternative narrative in which fraud had not occurred and Carver was innocent. But the defense had a fundamental problem: the ledger. No matter what the witnesses said, no matter how they explained other transactions, they could not explain away the existence of Carver's own documentation of fraud. The ledger sat at the center of the case like a stone, immovable and indisputable. When the moment came for Carver to testify, the courtroom was absolutely still. The defendant rose, walked to the witness stand, and placed his hand on a Bible. He was sworn in. Then Morse began his questioning. Carver's testimony was masterful. He did not deny the ledger's existence, but claimed it had been stolen, that someone had broken into his office and taken his private records specifically to damage him. He acknowledged that he had engaged in certain property transactions after the fire, but claimed all had been legal and legitimate. He suggested that the reporter had fabricated certain entries, that the ledger had been altered, that he was being persecuted by people motivated by vendetta. "I made money after the Great Fire," Carver testified. "So did many men. Chicago was being rebuilt. There were opportunities, and I took advantage of them. But I did nothing illegal. I did nothing that other men were not doing. The only difference between me and many other successful businessmen is that I am being prosecuted and they are not." It was a powerful defense built on the grain of truth that many men had profited from the fire, that the standards of business had been looser then, that Carver's specific actions were not so different from the normal conduct of commerce. Greenberg's cross-examination attacked the testimony, but could not completely dismantle it. Carver was too controlled, too intelligent, too experienced in the manipulation of language to be easily rattled. Closing arguments consumed 2 days. Greenberg built his case methodically. The ledger was Carver's documentation of his own crimes. The transactions were not normal business, but systematic fraud. Carver had conspired with other officials to manipulate the post-fire chaos for personal profit. Each point was supported by evidence, by documentation, by testimony from multiple sources. Morse's closing was equally compelling. The prosecution had not proven its case beyond reasonable doubt. The ledger's authenticity was questionable. The reporter was a biased investigator with personal motivation. Even if irregularities had occurred, they did not constitute criminal conspiracy. Judge Bram instructed the jury on the law, defining the terms of the charges, explaining what had to be proven for conviction. The jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom emptied. The reporter sat alone in the gallery, understanding that the next hours or days would determine whether the investigation had succeeded or failed. The jury deliberated for 4 days. Rumors circulated about divisions, about holdouts, about the possibility that a mistrial would be declared. The reporter waited, moving between the Herald offices and Donovan's precinct house, occupying time with work while understanding that the actual work was done. Everything now depended on 12 people's understanding of evidence and culpability. On the 5th day, the jury returned. The foreman stood and announced the verdicts. Thomas Carver was convicted on 3 counts: conspiracy, fraud, and receiving bribes. He was acquitted on 5 other counts. 2 of Carver's co-conspirators were convicted. The others were acquitted. It was not absolute victory, but it was victory. The man who had murdered the reporter's father, who had built an empire on stolen property and manipulated chaos, had been convicted of federal crimes. He would face imprisonment. His career was destroyed. His reputation was ruined. The reporter did not feel triumph. He felt exhaustion and something like sadness. Justice had been achieved, but it was partial, incomplete, insufficient to compensate for what had been lost. His father remained dead. Rose remained in exile. Years of the reporter's life had been consumed by investigation and litigation. The partial victory was better than nothing, but it was not what his younger self had imagined justice would be. Carver's sentencing came 3 weeks later. Judge Bram imposed 5 years in federal prison. Carver's associates who had been convicted received similar sentences. The reporter watched from the gallery as Carver stood to hear his sentence. The man's face was stone, his body rigid with controlled rage. He did not look at the reporter, did not acknowledge the gallery, did not react visibly, as his life was dismantled by judicial procedure. But as Carver was led away by federal marshals, he turned and met the reporter's eyes for just a moment. In that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of the other's commitment and sacrifice. Or perhaps only rage. The reporter could not be certain. The moment lasted less than a second, then Carver was gone. The Herald's series of articles about the investigation won recognition from other newspapers. Sterling was praised for his commitment to truth. The reporter was offered positions at larger papers, opportunities to leave Chicago and build a career elsewhere. Greenberg, the federal prosecutor, suggested that the reporter might consider law school, that his skills would serve him well in a legal career. But the reporter was tired. The investigation had consumed nearly 6 years of his life. The trial had consumed the better part of a year. He was 34 years old and felt ancient, worn down by the machinery of justice, exhausted by the endless documentation and presentation of evidence. When Sterling offered him the option of taking a 6-month leave of absence, the reporter accepted immediately. "I need to rest," he told the editor. "I need to remember what work feels like when it's not about exposing crimes." Sterling understood. "When you're ready to return, there will be a position for you. This kind of reporter, one who can actually document truth instead of simply reporting rumor, is rare. I'm not going to let you escape easily." The reporter left Chicago in the autumn of 1896, boarding a train to New York. He told no one of his plans, except Donovan and Sterling. He checked into a modest hotel in Brooklyn and did nothing for 2 weeks but read, sleep, and walk through neighborhoods he did not know. In New York, he could be anonymous. He could sit in coffee houses without scanning for threats. He could walk down streets without checking for patterns that suggested surveillance. The constant vigilance that had defined his life in Chicago could finally be relaxed. After 2 weeks, he began to write. Not journalism, but reflection. He wrote about the investigation, about the people involved, about the machinery of justice and its limitations. He wrote about his father, about Henrik, about Rose, about all the people whose lives had intersected with the investigation. The writing was not for publication, it was for himself, an attempt to organize experience into meaning. By November, he had decided to return to Chicago. The investigation was over. Carver was imprisoned. The conspiracy had been exposed. There was nothing more to hide from, nothing more to fear. Chicago was his city, however much it had tried to kill him. He belonged there in ways he did not belong in New York. Sterling welcomed him back with a promotion. The reporter would become the Herald's chief investigative editor, overseeing other reporters, training younger journalists in the craft of documentation and exposure. The position would keep him in Chicago, but would distance him from the daily grind of reporting. He would work from an office rather than from the streets, would guide investigations rather than conduct them himself. "You've proven yourself," Sterling said. "Now it's time to pass on what you've learned. There are other stories in this city that need exposing. Other people willing to do the work, if they're trained properly. You can do more by teaching than you can do by working alone." The reporter accepted the position. It felt like the right transition, like the natural conclusion of one phase and the beginning of another. He was no longer the young man driven by obsession and rage. He was becoming something else, a teacher, a mentor, a person capable of directing the work of others rather than doing everything himself. He returned to the rooms above what had once been Henrik's print shop. The shop itself had been sold years ago, but the reporter had maintained the apartment. Standing in the space where he had learned to love words, surrounded by Henrik's books and Henrik's absence, he understood that the investigation had not ended. It had only transformed. The questions that had driven his father would continue to drive others. The work of exposing truth would never be finished. But at least now, standing in that room, he could imagine a future that extended beyond the next revelation, the next threat, the next court appearance. He could imagine a life that included more than investigation. He could begin to imagine possibility. The Herald sent him to New York for 6 months in the spring of 1897, a position on loan to the New York Tribune to establish an investigative unit. The city was different from Chicago, older, denser, more entrenched in its corruption. Where Chicago had rebuilt itself raw and hungry after the fire, New York had calcified into systems that had functioned for decades without fundamental challenge. The newspaper work was competent, but felt distant, as if he was conducting investigations in a language he understood theoretically, but could not quite speak natively. He lived in a boarding house in Greenwich Village, in a neighborhood where artists and writers gathered in coffee houses to argue about politics and aesthetics. He attended readings, listened to poets recite work about cities and alienation, sat in the back of rooms while younger men debated the future of American letters. None of it interested him. He was too tired for artistic ambitions, too marked by his years in Chicago to engage with people who treated life as material for aesthetic consideration. By autumn, he knew he could not stay. The investigation he was conducting in New York felt hollow, a repetition of patterns he had already mastered. The city itself held no fascination for him. He missed Chicago not despite its dangers, but because of them. The city had tried to kill him, and he had survived. That created a bond, a sense of belonging that New York, safer, more distant, more indifferent, could not offer. He wrote to Sterling expressing his desire to return early. Sterling's response was immediate: "Come back." The Herald had too many stories that needed investigating, too many young reporters who needed training, too much work for one man to handle alone. His absence had created a void that other people could not adequately fill. Chicago greeted him in November with cold rain and the smell of stockyard smoke. The city felt smaller than it had when he left, less threatening now that Carver was imprisoned, now that the investigation had been publicly vindicated. The Herald offices were busier than he remembered, more crowded with reporters, more energetic with the work of journalism. Sterling had expanded the investigative unit, hired additional reporters, created a structure that could handle multiple investigations simultaneously. "We've learned from your work," Sterling explained, showing him the new organizational system. "We've learned that corruption operates according to patterns. Once you understand the patterns, you can investigate systematically rather than haphazardly. We have reporters working on warehouse regulations, on union organizing, on building permits. Each investigation follows the methodology you developed." The reporter understood what Sterling was doing, making the investigation into a professional apparatus rather than the work of a single obsessed individual. The work would continue after the reporter retired, or died, or moved on. The Herald's commitment to exposing corruption had become institutional rather than personal. Officer Pete Donovan had been promoted to captain, commanding a unit of detectives who worked corruption cases. The reporter and Donovan began meeting regularly at the precinct house, sharing information, collaborating on investigations that interested both the newspaper and the police department. The relationship had evolved from dangerous alliance to genuine partnership. Donovan had become the reporter's closest friend, the one person he could speak to without reservation about the weight of the investigation. "You look different," Donovan said one evening, studying the reporter carefully. "Less like you're about to explode. More like you've already exploded and survived it." "I spent 6 months in New York being bored," the reporter replied. "It reminded me that I belong here. For better or worse, this city is mine. I can't imagine living anywhere else now. Even after everything it's done to you, maybe because of everything it's done to me. I know this city's secrets. I know what's underneath the surface. That makes me responsible in some way. I can't abandon that responsibility." Donovan nodded with the understanding of a man who carried his own burdens of responsibility. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two men who had been tested by the city and had chosen to remain in it despite the damage. In early December, a letter arrived from Rose. She had been living in Boston, working as a singing teacher, building a quiet life away from the theater. She had heard about the reporter's return to Chicago and wanted him to know that she was safe, that her escape had been successful, that she had forgiven him for putting her at risk. "You did what you had to do," she wrote. "I did what I had to do. Neither of us could have done differently. The investigation mattered more than any individual safety, including mine. I understand that now, though it took time to reach that understanding. I hope you're well. I hope Chicago has learned to treat you less harshly." The reporter read the letter multiple times, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not realized he was carrying. He had worried about Rose's fate, had blamed himself for her exile, had wondered whether she resented him for the role she had played in the investigation. Her letter provided absolution he had not expected. He responded with his own letter, thanking her for her courage, expressing his hope that her new life in Boston was bringing her peace. The exchange transformed something in him, allowing him to reframe the investigation not as a series of sacrifices he had demanded from others, but as a collective effort in which multiple people had chosen to participate. Everyone had paid a price. Everyone had also chosen to pay it. The investigation into Carver's associates continued through 1897 and 1898. One by one, men who had been convicted in federal court faced state-level prosecutions for related crimes. Building regulations were tightened. Property transfers were subjected to new scrutiny. The insurance industry was reformed, with new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent fraudulent claims. The changes were not revolutionary. The city remained corrupt, its system still vulnerable to manipulation and bribery. But certain specific forms of fraud became more difficult to execute. Certain chains of command were disrupted. The consequences of being discovered were elevated in ways that made casual corruption riskier. The reporter understood that this represented victory, even if it was not total victory. The perfect justice he had imagined when he first began investigating his father's death would never arrive. But the imperfect justice that had been achieved was significant. It had changed the city in measurable ways, had deterred certain crimes, had held certain people accountable. By 1898, the active investigation had largely concluded. Carver remained imprisoned, his sentence continuing until 1902. His associates were either imprisoned, exiled from the city, or living with diminished power and constant vulnerability to future exposure. The fraud that had built on the Great Fire had been documented, prosecuted, and punished, at least partially. The reporter began to reduce his involvement in active investigations, delegating more work to younger journalists, focusing his efforts on training and mentorship. He realized that the obsession that had driven him through his 30s was beginning to fade, replaced by a more sustainable approach to work that allowed for periods of rest and reflection. He began taking walks along Lake Michigan in the mornings before work, observing the city from a distance, trying to see it as it actually was, rather than as a landscape of crimes waiting to be exposed. He started attending concerts at the newly completed Auditorium Theater, discovering that music could occupy his mind in ways that journalism could not. He ate meals that were not prepared quickly, but taken slowly, tasted consciously, appreciated. In the spring of 1899, Officer Donovan suggested that the reporter take an extended leave. "You're running on memory," Donovan said bluntly. You're no longer running on passion. That means you're burning out. The investigation almost destroyed you once. Don't let it destroy you again, just more slowly. The reporter accepted the suggestion. Sterling agreed to a 3-month leave, during which the reporter would have no official obligations to the Herald. He spent the first month at a small hotel outside the city, reading newspapers from across the country, watching the world continue its transformation, understanding that Chicago was not the center of everything, but simply one city among many. He traveled west in the second month, by train through the prairie states, through mountains he had never seen, into territories that seemed utterly foreign to his Chicago-formed consciousness. In Colorado, he discovered a small newspaper that was conducting investigations into mining operations with approaches similar to his own methodology. He spent a week consulting with the editor, sharing his experiences, understanding that the work he had done in Chicago had become a model for investigative journalism in other places. He returned to Chicago in early summer, refreshed in a way he had not anticipated. The distance had clarified his relationship to the work. He loved journalism, loved the process of asking questions and documenting answers. But he could no longer make it his only identity. He needed other dimensions to his life, other sources of meaning and satisfaction. Sterling welcomed him back with a new proposal. The Herald wanted to expand its investigative unit further, wanted to establish a permanent structure for corruption investigations that would continue independent of any single reporter's involvement. The reporter would become the director of this unit, overseeing a team of 6 journalists, training them, coordinating their work, ensuring that investigations met the Herald's standards for documentation and accuracy. "You won't be doing as much reporting yourself," Sterling acknowledged, "but you'll be doing more important work. You'll be creating a system that can continue investigating corruption regardless of which specific person is involved." "That's bigger than any individual investigation." The reporter accepted the position. It represented the natural evolution of his work, from individual investigation to systematic structure, from being the story himself to directing others who would become the stories. By the autumn of 1899, life in Chicago had settled into a new pattern. He worked at the Herald in the morning, meeting with reporters, reviewing investigation protocols, discussing strategies for future stories. He spent afternoons at Donovan's precinct house, collaborating with police detectives, coordinating investigations that served both the newspaper and law enforcement. Evenings were increasingly his own. He attended concerts, read philosophy texts, spent time in coffee houses, talking with other journalists and writers about the nature of truth and its relationship to journalism. He began attending dinners at Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house, where she now served meals to the neighborhood's prominent citizens and professionals. The Polish landlady, who had fed him soup when he was homeless, now received him as an honored guest, sitting at her table alongside judges and businessmen. In December, Officer Donovan brought him a newspaper clipping from a San Francisco paper. A man named James Finney had been arrested in connection with a murder committed 28 years earlier. The murder had occurred in Chicago in 1871, shortly after the Great Fire. The authorities suspected Finney had fled west after the crime and had lived quietly in California for decades, before being identified through old documentation. The reporter read the article carefully. The timeline matched. The description of the victim, a clerk investigating property fraud, matched his father. He understood that this was the man Carver had hired to murder his father. That Finney, after nearly 3 decades, was finally being held accountable for a crime committed in the service of corruption. He felt a strange calm reading the article. Finney would be prosecuted in California, far from Chicago, years after the crime. The prosecution would be difficult, relying on decades-old evidence and testimony from people whose memories had faded. It was unlikely that Finney would be convicted. But at least the crime was being acknowledged. At least someone was being held accountable. At least the official record would reflect what had happened. That evening he took a long walk along Lake Michigan, watching the sun descend toward the horizon, reflecting on the course of the investigation. His father's murder had been acknowledged in court documents. His father's investigation had been completed and published. His father's death had not been made right, could not be made right, but it had been made visible. He thought about Henrik, dead now for more than a decade, but present in every act of the reporter's journalism. Henrik had preserved his father's notebook, had sheltered the boy, had guided him toward the work that would define his life. Without Henrik's quiet intervention, the investigation would never have happened. His father's murderers would never have been exposed. He thought about Rose, living in Boston, building a new life, having chosen to participate in the investigation, and then chosen to extract herself from its consequences. She had been brave in ways the reporter had only learned to appreciate with time and distance. He thought about Benjamin Cole and all the people whose testimony and cooperation had made the investigation possible. Ordinary people, mostly, who had noticed crimes and been willing to talk about them if approached carefully and respectfully. The investigation had not been the work of one person, but of a community of people who valued truth despite its costs. By the turn of the century, the reporter understood that the investigation had not ended, but had transformed. The acute phase was over. Carver was imprisoned. The conspiracy had been exposed. The immediate dangers had passed. But the investigation continued in different forms, in the protocols the Herald had established for future investigations, in the training the reporter provided to younger journalists, in the systematic attention to corruption that had become embedded in the newspaper's culture. He was 34 years old and no longer driven by rage or the need for vengeance. He was becoming something steadier, more grounded, more capable of sustaining work over decades rather than burning with intensity for a limited time. The price the investigation had extracted was high, but he had survived it. He had been transformed by it, but he remained alive. Standing on the lakeshore as night fell, watching lights come on across the city, he understood that this was enough. The investigation had mattered. It had changed Chicago in small but significant ways. It had honored his father's memory by completing the work his father had begun. It had exposed corruption and held certain people accountable. It had not created perfect justice, but it had created something real. The printing press clacked with familiar rhythm, unchanged in its essential nature, despite the 3 decades that had passed since the reporter first learned to feed paper into its mechanism. He stood beside a young apprentice, demonstrating how to oil the bearings, how to recognize when the rollers needed cleaning, how to sense through practiced attention when something was not quite right. The boy was 16, eager, still believing that the world worked according to rules that could be learned through application and discipline. "You have to listen to it," the reporter explained, placing his hand on the press's frame so the vibration traveled through his palm. "The machine tells you what it needs, if you pay attention. Most people don't listen. They just operate the mechanism without understanding it. But if you listen, really listen, you start to understand what it wants." The boy nodded solemnly, absorbing this wisdom as if it pertained to printing, rather than to something more fundamental about the nature of attention and relationship. The reporter smiled at his own pretension. He had become the kind of man who extracted philosophy from mechanical systems, who saw lessons about life embedded in the practical work of journalism. The Herald's offices had moved to a larger building on South Clark Street, a structure designed specifically for a major newspaper's operations. The printing press occupied the basement, a newer model than the one Henrik had operated, but built on the same principles. The compositing room was on the ground floor, where typesetters worked, assembling pages at remarkable speed, their fingers moving through cases of type with practiced precision. The newsroom occupied the upper floors, where reporters and editors conducted the business of gathering and shaping information into publishable form. The reporter divided his time between all these spaces. Most mornings he was in the newsroom, working with the 6 journalists who staffed the investigative unit. Most afternoons he was in the archives or the courthouse, or conducting interviews for ongoing investigations. Some evenings he was in the printing area, observing the transformation of edited copy into finished newspaper, understanding the final stage of journalism's long process. Jack Sterling had retired 2 years earlier, passing editorial control to a younger man named Edward Hutchins, who had worked under Sterling's direction for more than a decade. Hutchins was competent, progressive in his thinking about journalism's role in a democracy, and respectful enough of the reporter's methods to allow him significant autonomy. The Herald remained committed to investigative journalism, remained willing to pursue stories that powerful people would prefer remained hidden. The reporter was 37 years old now, in 1901, no longer young, but not yet old. His hair had begun to gray at the temples. His face showed the marks of years spent reading fine print and staring at documents in poor light. His body was lean from decades of restless movement, accustomed to coffee instead of meals, to walking instead of sitting, to the constant, low-level urgency that defined newspaper work. He had moved from the rooms above Henrik's print shop, sold to a developer 5 years earlier, to a modest apartment on the North Shore near the lake. The apartment was spare, furnished with books and little else, a space designed for someone who was rarely home and spent most of his time in motion. He kept Henrik's books there, maintained the leather-bound notebook that had contained his father's initial investigation, preserved artifacts of the life that had shaped him. Anna Kowalski was a librarian at the Chicago Public Library, the niece of Mrs. Kowalski, who had fed him soup when he was homeless. She was intelligent, observant, capable of quiet patience with the reporter's distracted attention. They had met at a public lecture about city history and had gradually begun spending time together, dinners at restaurants, walks along the lake, evenings at the library after hours, when she would show him new acquisitions and they would discuss the ideas those books contained. Anna understood that the reporter would never be entirely present in any relationship, because parts of him were always engaged with work. She did not try to change this about him, but simply accepted it, creating space for the parts of him that were available while maintaining her own separate life. They had not discussed marriage or permanent commitment. The arrangement was comfortable, companionable, sufficient. Officer Pete Donovan, now captain of detectives, had bought a house in a neighborhood developing on the city's southwest side. He had married a school teacher and fathered 2 children. His life had acquired the stability that came from successful career and family responsibility. But he and the reporter still met regularly, still collaborated on investigations, still maintained the friendship that had been forged in the dangerous years of the 1890s. "You're different now," Donovan said during one of their evening meetings. "Less like you're trying to prove something. More like you're just doing the work because it's the work." "Is that bad?" "No, it's better. It's sustainable." "The other way, the way you were before, that burns people up. I've watched too many good reporters consume themselves chasing perfect justice. You've learned to accept imperfect victories and continue working anyway. That takes wisdom." Sterling came to the Herald offices occasionally, visiting his old domain, observing how Hutchins was managing the newspaper. He had aged noticeably, his hair completely white now, his movements slower. But his mind remained sharp, and he took obvious satisfaction in seeing the investigative unit thriving, in understanding that the methodology he had allowed the reporter to develop had become the Herald's institutional practice. "You've done well," Sterling told him during one visit, sitting in the reporter's small office overlooking the newsroom. "You've built something that will outlast us both. That's what the best journalism does. It creates structures that continue the work even after the individuals who initiated them have moved on. That's legacy." The reporter accepted this assessment without argument. He understood that he had been given unusual opportunities. An editor willing to risk publishing dangerous stories. Sources willing to provide crucial information. A city that had not killed him, despite serious attempts. Those opportunities had created the foundation for the work that continued now. In the spring of 1901, a young journalist applied for a position in the investigative unit. His name was William Chen, and he was the son of Chinese immigrants, educated at Northwestern, speaking English with barely an accent. He carried recommendations from multiple sources, demonstrated knowledge of investigative methodology, and expressed clear understanding of the Herald's commitment to systematic corruption investigations. The reporter recognized something of himself in Chen's intensity, his hunger to understand how systems actually worked beneath their official presentations, his willingness to take risks in pursuit of truth. Chen was hired immediately and quickly began working on stories about labor exploitation in the garment industry, about building code violations in tenement neighborhoods, about systematic discrimination in hiring practices. Chen came to the reporter with questions constantly, wanting to understand not just the facts of corruption, but the methodology for uncovering it. The reporter found himself explaining principles he had absorbed through years of practical experience, but had never fully articulated. How to identify sources, how to verify information, how to construct narratives that were both accurate and compelling, how to remain safe while investigating dangerous people. "You're teaching me how to be a dangerous person," Chen said once with a slight smile. "Not dangerous in the way that creates violence, but dangerous to people who benefit from corruption remaining hidden." "Is that a problem?" "No. It's what I came here to learn. I just wanted to acknowledge it clearly." The reporter appreciated the honesty. He understood that he was passing on not just professional skills, but a particular ethical stance toward journalism, a commitment to truth that acknowledged truth's costs and risks, but proceeded anyway, because the alternative was complicity. By late 1901, Anna had become a permanent part of his life. She attended Herald functions, met his colleagues, understood the nature of his work and its demands. She had suggested, gently and without pressure, that they might consider marrying, that such formality would not change their relationship, but might provide certain practical advantages. The reporter had resisted for months, uncertain whether he was capable of sustaining a marriage while remaining committed to journalism. But Anna had patience, understood his hesitations, waited without demanding commitment. By autumn, he had agreed. They married quietly, with only Donovan and Mrs. Kowalski as witnesses, and moved together into a larger apartment that could accommodate two people's lives. Marriage surprised him by being easier than he had anticipated. Anna did not require his constant attention or presence. She worked her own career at the library, maintained her own friendships, pursued her own interests. Their time together was shared consciously, valued more deeply because it was finite. She had become his ballast, the anchor that prevented him from flying apart completely into the abstraction of work. A letter arrived one evening in December, forwarded from the Herald offices. It was from California, from a man who had worked at the San Francisco newspaper where the reporter had consulted years earlier. The man had information about James Finney, the man arrested for the reporter's father's murder. Finney had been tried in San Francisco and convicted. The evidence had been stronger than anticipated. Old documents, testimony from a man who had worked with Finney decades earlier, records that established Finney's presence in Chicago during the relevant period. Finney had been sentenced to life imprisonment, where he had died 6 months later of pneumonia. The murderer had paid a price, even if the price came 28 years after the crime. The reporter read the letter multiple times, trying to feel something significant about this conclusion. Finney's death did not bring his father back, did not undo the decades of absence, did not restore the life his father should have had. But it represented acknowledgement, consequences, the belated operation of justice working through systems that were imperfect but functional. He showed the letter to Anna, who read it carefully and understood its significance without needing explanation. "Your father's death has been answered," she said quietly. "The man who murdered him has been held accountable. That's what you wanted, isn't it? Not perfect justice, but the acknowledgement that the crime mattered." "Yes," the reporter said. "That's exactly what I wanted." In the spring of 1902, Thomas Carver completed his prison sentence and was released from federal custody. He was older, diminished, stripped of his political power and social standing. The reporter, learning of Carver's release, felt surprisingly little. The man who had consumed so much of his energy, who had threatened his life, who had murdered his father, that man was now old and powerless, a footnote in Chicago's history rather than a force shaping its present. Carver lived quietly on the outskirts of the city, in a neighborhood where he was not known, operating a small bookkeeping business. He had no influence, no protection, no ability to threaten anyone. He had become what his crimes had been designed to prevent: insignificant, powerless, forgotten by everyone except those directly affected by what he had done. The reporter did not seek him out, did not pursue additional investigations, did not attempt to complete some narrative arc by confronting Carver directly. The investigation was finished. The story had been told. Carver belonged to history now, not to the reporter's present concerns. By 1903, the reporter had trained a generation of journalists in the methodology he had developed. William Chen had become the lead investigator on a series of stories about labor exploitation that was gaining attention beyond Chicago. Other reporters whom the Herald had trained had moved to newspapers in other cities, carrying with them the understanding that systematic investigation could expose corruption that conventional journalism missed. The work continued without him, which was exactly as he had hoped. He was no longer the single person without whom the investigations could not proceed. He had made himself replaceable, had transferred knowledge to others, had built systems that could survive his retirement or death. One afternoon in November, standing at a printing press in the Herald's basement, showing a new apprentice how to oil the bearings, the reporter understood that his life had come full circle. He had entered the newspaper world as an orphaned boy, learning to set type in Henrik's shop. He was leaving it as a mentor, training young people in skills he had acquired through decades of practice. The machinery was different, the scale was larger, but the essence remained unchanged. The work of journalism was the work of translation, taking the complexity of the world and rendering it into language that could be understood, that could be acted upon, that could change how people understood what was possible. It was humble work in its essential nature, despite its importance. It required patience, attention to detail, commitment to accuracy, and acceptance that you would never know the full consequences of your reporting. He took a walk along Lake Michigan on a cold December evening, the lake dark and vast, the city lights reflecting off the water. Anna had wanted to attend a concert that evening, but he had declined, had wanted solitude to think. He was 39 years old, had been working at the Herald for more than 20 years, had dedicated nearly half his life to investigating corruption and training others to do the same. The investigation that had consumed him through his 20s and 30s had become his career, then his profession, then his identity. But that investigation was complete now, had been absorbed into the larger work of systematic journalism. His father's death had been avenged in the limited way that revenge was possible. The conspiracy had been exposed. The city had been forced to reform itself in small but significant ways. What remained was the work itself, the daily practice of asking questions, of documenting answers, of publishing truth in a form that allowed others to act upon it. That work would continue as long as newspapers existed, as long as corruption took advantage of hidden spaces, as long as people cared enough about truth to risk something in its pursuit. He thought about Rose, living in Boston with her new life. He thought about Henrik, dead more than 20 years, preserved in memory and in the books he had left behind. He thought about his father, finally avenged, though his murder had taken decades to move from secret to acknowledgement. He thought about the city itself, changed in small ways by the work of exposing what had been hidden. The city was still corrupt, would always contain corruption. The systems the reporter had helped establish would not prevent all fraud, would not catch every criminal, would not create perfect justice. But the work would continue, generation after generation, people asking questions about how power actually operated, documenting the answers, publishing what they discovered. That seemed sufficient. Not perfect, but sufficient. Not complete, but continuous. Not a solution, but a practice, a way of engaging with the world that acknowledged both its corruption and its capacity for accountability. As darkness fell completely and the cold pushed him to begin walking back toward the apartment where Anna was reading by the fire, the reporter understood that this was how lives worked. You started with questions inherited from others. pursued those questions through years of risk and difficulty. Eventually, transformed yourself from the person asking into the person teaching others to ask. The questions never ended, but the acute phase of your personal struggle did. You moved forward into the next stage, carrying the scars, but no longer driven by the fever. Lights came on across the city in the gathering darkness. Street lamps, building lights, the illuminated windows of thousands of people living their separate lives. Somewhere in those lights, new corruption was occurring, new frauds being perpetrated, new injustices being committed. Tomorrow, the reporters at the Herald would begin investigating some of those stories. The work would continue. The city would transform itself through the combination of exposures and reforms, slowly, imperfectly, but perceptibly. He walked back toward home through neighborhoods that had changed and would continue changing, toward the woman who had learned to accept him as he actually was, rather than trying to reshape him into something more conventional. Behind him, the lake lay dark and indifferent to human concerns, older than the city, older than the corruption the city had been built on, indifferent to whether men were just or unjust. That indifference was somehow comforting. It meant the work mattered not because it served some cosmic purpose, but because people cared enough to do it anyway. The fire that had destroyed Chicago and created the opportunity for the fraud his father had been investigating had occurred more than 30 years ago. The reporter had been born from the ashes of that fire, shaped by its aftermath, defined by his attempts to expose the theft it had enabled. The fire had consumed a city and created a man who would spend his life understanding what emerged from that consumption. Tomorrow he would return to the Herald and continue the work. Next week he would train new reporters. Next month he would oversee investigations. Next year he would watch younger people take over responsibilities he had held. The work was not dramatic anymore, not urgent with the intensity it had been. But it was real. It mattered. It would continue after he was gone, done by people he had trained, informed by principles he had helped establish. That seemed like a life well spent.